we're going to create a rocky landscape using procedural terrain. And to start, what we're going to do is create a base layer of sharp, jagged rocks, and then mix that together with a terrain fractal. So I'm going to start by adding in procedural terrain to the scene, and we're going to edit the object. Go over to the Procedural tab. First, going to the left here, I'm just going to turn off zero edges, and then edit the function for the altitude production. What we want to do, we can just use the existing setup in the default setup, changing the simple fractal, and we're going to switch over the noise. And what we want to use is a distributed pattern. We're going to be using square samples in order to get a nice fine edge for the rock, but something that's going to not tear at all and is going to also look better than, say, the strata filter and what it can do to shadows and the diffuse lighting. So we need something that's going to be smooth, so we can pick between the 2D and the full 3D samples. Each noise setting has its own pros and cons. The 2D versions will render faster, but they don't really allow any extra rotations and modifications with the rotation and twist that are usable. And that's for the vector using that node. And we'll take a look at both of them. We'll start with the square samples 2D. We can just zoom in a little bit and take a look. Now if we check, and I do have the function output observer open, which can be opened with that little camera icon in the upper right, and the function node preview is right next to that, and that's going to give you your numeric output for the XYZ. You will see that there is no Z for the 2D. So you're just working with the X and Y. If we check only when saturating on and off, we'll be able to see the noise a little bit better. What you're going to see are some tears on the side. So what we need to do is modify this to remove some of those edges. What I'm going to do is go to the noise and the base settings and edit. We're going to turn on fine maximums, and we're going to check random altitudes. And that in and of itself is going to take care of most of those issues. There are still going to be a couple of tears here and there. So what we need to do is reduce our size of our samples. We're going to change our shape to round pyramid. That's going to give us a really nice rounded edge. It's going to render really nicely. We want to add some scale variations and also some angular variations. We can turn down randomness a little bit, and then we're going to change the samples from 4 to 0 to 3. So that way we have a lot more variation. Now if we were to take the size and bring it down a lot smaller, we're going to see a lot less rocks because they're not overlapping. The very small rocks we see on the bottom are created by the roughness setting. So let's go ahead and bring that size up to 0.35. Click OK. And if we take a look at the roughness, we can remove a lot of those very small samples by just adjusting the roughness setting. So I'm going to go with about 0.43 just to start with. Go ahead and bring our scale back to 1. And What we can also do is use the metascale in order to increase the variation of altitude. Right now, with the way this is set up, we just have the largest feature being used. So for larger terrains, if we were to expand the size, these rocks are going to stay basically the same. If we start to bring in the metascale, we can add an additional layer of variation. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and change this to 5 kilometers for the largest feature, and let's go ahead and use 13 kilometers for the metascale. And that looks pretty good. We can also turn on the with rotation option. Now, because there is no Z information, once we turn on the rotation, it's going to take basically that absence of numeric information from the fractal and that vector not really existing, and it's going to twist it and work it into the rest of the noise. So now you'll see that there is information on the Z. It can create these very thin strips, and they may not necessarily be desirable. In this case, they actually look okay. Depending on the angular variation in the scales, sometimes it can tear or just not really look right. But there's not really a whole lot of control you have just by turning on with rotation. It's kind of an automatic mode. So with the rotation off, without making any further changes, I just want to take a look at the terrain, show you what it's going to look like when it's rendered. Obviously we're going to be modifying and mixing different things together, but this will give you a good idea of what some of the jagged rocks can look like, because this is a really nice noise. So we're just going to move the camera around just a little. And I'm just using the right click to pan around or rotate around the camera, tilting it. And then you can hold down Shift and right click in order to pan or scroll side to side. I do have my keyboard shortcuts modified. And you'll see me doing a lot of major manipulations for vector manipulations: scale, size, rotate, and also move, mainly with my keyboard shortcuts. So I'm just using the gizmos. If you're not familiar with using the gizmos, if you go to the number pad, you can use the plus and minus to increase or decrease the size of the gizmo, and then on the right there is a scale on the bottom, rotate in the middle, and then move up on the top. So I just use my thumb buttons on my mouse for that. If those gizmos are not showing, you can go to Display and Gizmos and Show Gizmos. And then I just have all of these other options checked. You can see my keyboard shortcuts probably are a little bit different. E for position, R for rotate, T for size. I think some of those are the standard ones. Do a quick render here. And go to the render settings. I'm just going to set this to final. Render it to screen. I'll go ahead and take a look. So for the most part, there aren't a whole lot of problems with this. We are using a lower render quality. There is one section here where there's a line kind of coming through, and we do get some of those jagged polygons. Increasing the quality boost of the terrain will remove those. I also want to do another render of a larger section, and so we can see the peaks a little bit better. And I'm also going to just scale on the up and down axis, default Z axis. Now, using the keyboard shortcuts depending on how familiar you are with the program, you'll find that when the internal unit is set to 1 and you're trying to move around a smaller part of the scene, camera jumps around quite a bit. If you hold down the control key and use the camera control center, it will slow down the movement actions. It does make it a little bit easier. So taking a look at this peak, you can really see the amount of detail and variation we can get on vertical and steep slopes, which is why I like using this noise for creating a rocky type landscape, something we can mix with as a base. I'm going to be changing the metascale because it is, I think, not quite matching the way I want to have it. So what I may end up doing is changing my largest feature to 10 kilometers. And that way we're going to have the metascale and the largest feature close to each other within scale. And that way we can still get some of these larger separators. Because otherwise it's just blending together too much. We could also go into the scale and just reduce it a little bit for the size of each sample. If needed, we could also change our scale variations. So there's quite a bit we can do to really modify the samples. With the randomness, and if I go ahead and turn it off, it's going to basically move the samples to the same starting point. Now that will also be scaled and rotated with the angular variations from that central sample. So we could set it to 3 to 4 samples and have a lot more samples per, or a lot more blocks per sample. So there's a lot of different ways to customize it. I'm going to go ahead and bring that back. I'm also going to go ahead and save a copy of the scene at this point, so we can come back to it later, and so you'll be able to load in the different steps. So the scene at this point is going to be called Rocky Landscape _A_01. So now what I want to do is be able to customize the vector rotation, and what I'm going to do is add in, just clicking off of the node to get that red box, add in a math node. We could also right click and from the math node menu select from vector operations, rotation, and twist. With that as the last selected node, we can select the link between the fractal and the multiply by constant and add a new math node which will automatically connect it. Sometimes it can be a little bit quicker than just connecting different links. If you have a really complex function, it can start to bounce your nodes around and mess up any organization you might have. So sometimes it ends up being better to manually connect it. What we're going to do is click Edit for the transformation. And what we can do is take a look at how we can modify our rotation. So what we can do is customize this. Once again, because there is no information on the Z, if we go too far, we're going to end up with these bands just moving across until we move the vector back. So there's a minimal amount of rotation we can use. Same thing with the twist option. Some of the settings won't even work. As we can see, the first two twist sliders don't really have any effect. The X to Z will definitely skew or twist, as View has it listed, the vectors. But once again, we can really only modify it so much. And it's like that with the 3D version as well, with 3D samples, but you do have a lot more control. So we could do some minimal modifications this way, but we're not getting a whole lot of variation between the look. We're still mostly square for everything. So we're also going to take a look now at the 3D samples. So what I'm going to do is select the simple fractal, Control C on the keyboard, and click off of it, and Control V to paste. Because I do want to keep the other one here because it does have our other settings stored in it. And once I change this over to the other version, the edit variables within the noise are going to be set to default. So we'll change that over to the square samples, just the regular square samples. And you can see in the preview of the node that we now have information going up and down where we don't in the other one. Now, View does have a tendency to delete unconnected nodes from a function. So what I want to do is add in a Blender combiner node, or a combiner node is set to Blender. And then we're going to select input 1 from the top of the Blender and connect it to this new fractal. And for the ratio setting of the Blender, we're going to set it to 1. And what that's going to do is just switch it over to input 1. So all we're seeing is input 1. The other one's just kind of being stored at the moment. And that's just so that we don't lose the information. So I want to basically carry over my settings. So I'm just going to type in something close to those settings. We'll go ahead, 0.28 for the size, 0.65 for the randomness, 0.43 for the scale variation, 0.75 for the angular variation, and then we can turn on fine maximums, random altitudes, switch it to the round pyramid, and 0 to 3 samples per cell. So now we basically have the same setup as the other one, except that our biggest change is going to be the look of it based on the Z. If we switch this over, so what we can do now is just take our Blender and move it back and forth in order to see the difference between the two. Now there's going to be a bit of a change because of the origin of the Z. And if we go to the vector seed and change that number to 0, we might be able to get the same thing out of both, but more than likely, yeah, it's going to be a bit different. And that's just because it is sampling a 3D space rather than a fixed space, which doesn't really have much to choose from. So what we're going to be able to do now is get different cells at different Z heights and vector ranges and be able to rotate and twist them around and end up with a lot more jagged rock variations. So if we go into the rotation and twist and go to edit, we can now modify these a lot more than we could before, and we're not going to have any stretching or major scaling changes unless one of the wavelengths is significantly different than the others. Right now we have 4.5 for the X, Y, and Z. If I go ahead and set the Z to 1, we're going to see more of that stretching. So let's go ahead and set that to 3 to give us a little bit of a change. We'll do wavelength of 4 on the X and 5 on the Y. Go to rotation and twist. And now we can start to kind of twist the axes. And basically it's just skewing or squishing down as sort of a merge of the vectors. So we can get a lot of customization out of this. So let's just set 2 and -2 for the first two twist options, and then 15 for the last one. And we're not going to use a lot of rotation. We'll go ahead and set this to 31 on the Y. And that should be good for now. So we can close that out. And let's go ahead and just take a look at a quick render. And then we'll be able to start distorting the origin of this so that we can modify our shapes even further. Okay, so far it's looking pretty good. Now there's two different ways we can distort this. One is to modify the origin by using a turbulence. A turbulence node would be a faster setup. If you're looking for a little more control, we can create a custom turbulence out of a noise node, which is usually what I do. Because the main thing is we want to get rid of some of the square look. And I think I am going to modify our scale just a little bit. Let's go ahead and bring the wavelength of Y to 3. That looks a little bit better. I'm also going to just go ahead and save it really quick as another sequence. Or the next part of the sequence. So A_02 for the rocky landscape. Okay, so another thing we could do is to multiply this noise by another fractal or by a noise node in order to distort it, but I want more of a vector-like distortion because right now I think everything is a little too square. I would like to have a bit of large curvature. So what I'm going to do is extract the origin, and we could replace this with a turbulence. So a very simple setup is just to use a turbulence and adjust the largest feature. And if you need to, you can change that top link to make sure it connects to the multiply by constant, or the multiply node. And that way, you get a little more range on your scale. So I think actually this simple turbulence will work out alright. And that way we don't need to have an overly complex setup. So just want a bit of twisting. And some nice changes. Then we could just modify and kind of adjust these settings till we get something we like. Now, the other method I was talking about, being able to create your own turbulence. Now, if you own Snowflake, you can use the metanode, math node, Numeric Turbulence. And then this connects directly to a noise node and outputs a vector that will work as a distortion. And then you can modify the X, Y, and Z intensity. So if you own Snowflake 3.0 and higher, it comes with a Numeric Turbulence math node. Otherwise what you can do is kind of create one yourself. And what you can do is add in a math node, go to Vector Operations and choose the Composer 3. And this is going to take 3 numeric inputs and output a vector. So what you can do is add in a fractal or a noise node. And I'm just going to reset the fractal. And then you can connect all 3 connections for the composer to the fractal, and we're just going to swap out the turbulence right now. So now what we can do is modify this fractal and get a direct turbulence that way. And this way you have a little more control over the turbulence. And you can use the gain to increase the intensity or decrease it by lowering the gain. And that's a basic setup. If you want more control over the individual axes, you can add in a filter per link for the X, Y, and Z links, and switch it over to the multiply filter. So if you want to increase the intensity right now of the X, we can just multiply that number and set it to a higher amount. And that way we'll have more of an impact from this noise on that specific axis. We can also divide it by using a decimal point, and we can even go negative and then reverse the direction. So you could set one of those up for each individual link, and that way you have sort of a numeric turbulence. The Snowflake Metanode Numeric Turbulence also has offsets for each individual setting and the ability to turn off which axes you're using. So that's just another option. I'm just going to stick with just a simple turbulence to keep the scene mostly simple for the moment. So now we can start to see that curvature affecting the different peaks and the different sharp rocks coming out. And overall, you really get a nice bit of detail just on these vertical areas. Of course, throughout the entire terrain, it looks really interesting. But it is difficult typically to get these kind of patterns and shapes without using a more complex fractal. And the square samples is a rather complex, long rendering fractal for the most part. In comparison, at least to some of the other noises, it does take a bit longer to render, but it is definitely worth it. The 2D version doesn't take as long to render, so you can always use that one if you need something that's going to render a lot quicker. But for the most part, it's still not even that bad. Right now, for me, for a frame that's around 1600 pixels or so in width, at 16:9 ratio, it's only taking about a minute or two to render in the final mode. So that's not too bad. What we also want to do now is I'm going to save just another version of this, and I'm going to keep saving in different steps throughout the way. But there's another noise pattern that works really well that we can mix with this to add even more detail and remove some of the blockiness that's showing up on the sides of some of the different peaks. So I'm going to continue that part in another lesson. So in the next part we'll take a look at adding that secondary noise for the main rocks and jagged rocks, and then we can start mixing that together with a terrain and finish up the actual shaping and geometry for the terrain.